here. It is a Ronin Dojo Elite from roughly February 2018, the scratch and dent sale that Ronin put on. So do bear in mind that this is a scratch and dent version, and some of the issues that it has you may not expect in one that was not a scratch and dent one. Further, this is a donation from Swordfriend Garland, so tip of my hat and special thanks to him for sending this my way. It was sent specifically to review and push to failure to demonstrate the durability of the lamination that's on this sword, the blade of the Ronin Elites, as well as validate when I break it in half if it is laminated the way they say it is. I've had a few Ronin Dojo Elites, but I've never pushed one to failure. I've never actually gotten a Dojo Elite from Ronin Katana before. I bought one many moons ago in 2012. I sold that one because I found that the size and fittings just weren't to my liking after my tastes evolved. And I've also had another one, and it did have some issues, but I didn't push it to failure. It had some minor chipping in the edge, but from what I can recall on the medium that I was testing. I'll link that review in the description down below if you're interested in watching. Also, do note that Swordfriend Garland is selling a few of his other Ronin Elites, as well as some Project X stuff. Project X is very similar to the Ronin Elites, similar lamination technique, I believe, similar forge, but might have some like folded variety and some other bits and bobs that are a little bit of an upgrade. Anyway, I'll link his Sword Buyer's Guide sale page. He was trying to sell this, but it didn't move, and so it was donated to posterity. And so special thanks to him. Depending on when you watch this, he may or may not still have some other bits and bobs for sale. Plan for this review is just, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Ronin Elite, what I can tell you about it, and then I'm going to go over this sword, tell you how it moves for EI and the like, and then I'm going to kind of get right to it. I've reviewed the Ronin Elites before, so I don't know that I have a whole lot of new information, but I'm a little better with a camera now, maybe, so I'll give it a shot again. The Dojo Elites generally around $850. There's a few different varieties of swords, so this I think was probably closer to the $400 or $500 range, somewhere in that ballpark. That's usually what the scratch and dent versions would go for, but the new ones, so for about $850. It can be more if it is a longer sword or has some special embellishments or something special with the fittings or something like that, but generally speaking they're around $850, and you know, tip of my hat to them. Actually, it's been that price for quite some time. It's one of the few things that hasn't been pegged terribly by inflation. But anyway, the Dojo Elites are about $850. The thing that makes them cool or special or unique or different is a special lamination technique called Soshu Kite, and I'm probably not saying it correct, so forgive my pronunciation. Forgive it throughout the rest of the video because I screw a lot of stuff up. But the lamination technique is supposed to be harder than the average. There's a few different types of lamination techniques used by Chinese forges. Most commonly, you probably see sanmai, just 3 layers of steel. Sometimes there's one called kobusei, I believe is how it's pronounced. Could be wrong, but it's like a taco where it's wrapped around one side and there's a little bit sticking out rather than a sandwich. The steel wraps around. This has got 7 layers of steel, and it's just a more complicated thing. There's a lot more that can go wrong. The failure rate presumably is much higher, thus the cost is higher. So that's something that they do that is not terribly common, and at least from larger brand names, there's not a huge amount of Soshu Kite laminated style blades. Project X, the Sword Buyer's Guide Project X stuff, I believe they do same forge, similar techniques, but they have some folded stuff and full wraps of Samegao and some other bits and bobs, as I recall, that make it just one little step higher as well. And those usually went for around $1,000, but it could be way off in my pricing because I haven't checked in a very long time. Anyway, they tend to feel like the other Ronin swords, and by feeling, I mean they're usually about the same size, and they have, you know, a nice weight to them. This is a very pleasant sword to move, and I'll talk more about the dynamics and moving it around. But anyway, what you tend to get is something unique. So they're also not sold as like the Dojo Elite 7, and it's a common model. They're usually individually they're put together as kind of one-of-a-kind pieces. There's probably some overlap, but they're individually photographed and sold, or at least that's the way it was. And they have some similarities in terms of the build quality, and that the fittings tend to be the higher-end fittings that are available from the parts bin at Longquan forges. To me, they tend to look a little gaudy, and I prefer the simpler versions, and there's some of those that tend to be available as well. They tend to have this style Habaki on them, this, you know, emulation of a 2-piece, or at least something with some scratches and lines and a little bit of differentiation in it. The polish also has, you know, some element of polish. It's shiny, but you can kind of make out the differential hardening. And then there's usually some sort of spot where you can see lamination lines where the folding and forge welding is taking place. Given that these aren't folded steels that are used. There's no hata in terms of what you would see on a Japanese style sword. There's no folding pattern, but where the various types of steels, which I believe are 1045, 1060, and 1095, I think those are the ones that they use. Anyway, they use 3 different types of steels, I believe. You can kind of see where those steels come together in this forge line that, or this lamination line that you can make out somewhere in the right light. Anyway, that's kind of what makes them cool. There's other little bits that are nice. There's usually silk and buffalo horn components on the furniture. I'll talk through that though now. If I usually begin, well, not usually, I always begin in the pommel, this kashura, this butt cap right here. And you can kind of see the fitting area here, and that it's not bad, actually. I've seen much worse fittings, and I don't actually mind this one. It's not too overzazzed. Sometimes they're very bold, they're kind of clumsy to the feel, and the gold and silver paint looks like it's finger painted on. This one doesn't look as clumsily done, so I don't necessarily mind it, but it's still a little bit much for my personal taste. They're made of copper, and then they have some sort of gold and silver plating on them, and it looks okay. I can make out details and stuff in here. It's not bad. It doesn't create any hot spots, and so for what it is, I can't say that I mind the fittings, but again, still a little busy for me personally. Down here at the base, the Ito kind of bunches up around here. Now, this is one of their higher end swords, but I can't say that the finish quality is necessarily much different than what you might get on a Dojo Pro. And by that, I mean the Ito, the fittings, you know, some of the transitions and stuff like that are, I think, assembled by the same hands. The silk may be nicer, I'm not sure. The fittings might be a higher grade, but where I see issues in terms of wandering diamonds or bunchy Ito, I see that on just about any of the Ronin stuff. This looks like higher end materials, but not necessarily higher end fit and finish. Anyway, I can see it's bunched down here, and that's not great, but it's not the end of the world. No hot spots, nothing that bothers the feel of your hand, but at the same time, this Ito should transition a little bit more gracefully. It's something that I'd really hope to see on swords that are on the higher end scale of things. The Ito itself, as it moves up and transitions from the kashura, is the diamonds honestly don't wander a whole lot. They're not so bad in this one, and what I can say is that this is very, very tight, and I don't know if Sword Friend Garland applied some of their wax or material, or this is just absorbed oil from his hands. I can't say for sure, but this is, I think, the tightest handle that I've felt from Ronin. This isn't moving much at all. It's very, very tight. I can maybe displace 1 millimeter, but the diamonds don't deform, and everything feels tight. Even on the Manuki, they feel actually pretty solid. So handle tightness is good, and I'm glad that I got to see this example. I hope that I don't see any lacquer on here, but maybe sometimes wax or something like that gets applied to them, and I can't necessarily tell. If nothing has been done to this, which I'm speculating is the case, then I'm glad I got to see an example of a very, very tight one to know that they do happen. Many of the examples that I've seen from Ronin Katana are a little on the loose side. Passable, but on the loose side, and this feels excellent. So good on there. Shape-wise, it has a nice kind of wasted shape to it. I like it. It feels comfortable in my hand, not too big, but at the same time, not little either. It's just on the right side of things. I actually prefer them a little bit smaller. It's tough to find, though. This is graceful for what you can get on the market today, I think. Nodule size appears to be small. Detail on the Manuki as well. I can make out some details here, which is actually nice. They're all recast fittings, but when the mold gets used too much, things tend to get muddy. That's a thing that I look like. It looks like you tried to cast something in wax or make something very detailed, but then heated it up a little too much, and it loses some of the finer details. But I can make out some of those in here. It's not too bad. The Fuchi transitions, not so bad in most angles. Again, it's a little bit on the busy side, and it looks like the mold on this one is not necessarily holding up so great, but it's also been used quite a bit. I can tell from Sword Friend Garland, and some of the patina has worn away differently up here, where you might choke up on the grip versus on the pommel down here on the kashura, the end part. Anyway, it's a bit on the busy side, and you can see that the copper patina shows through. The wear of patina on fittings, it happens if you use the sword a lot. I've just about any sword that I've had that has some sort of paint or patina or anything like that tends to wear away if you use it quite a bit. The Tsuba, I do like one thing about these Tsuba. Again, they're not necessarily to my taste, but I like that they are kind of sculpted all the way around. Usually the outside rim is where the casting is done, and it's just neglected. And a lot of Japanese Tsuba had, kind of embellishments that wrapped around and used this object a little bit more three-dimensionally. And I see some of that here. I can make out that these, I believe they're shishi dogs, or are they dragons? But I think they're I think they're dogs. Anyway, they wrap around the outside of the Tsuba around the rim, which is kind of neat to see. And it also has this kind of, I don't know, it looks like a raised rim look, but at the same time, I think that might just be the way that it's molded. I'm not sure if this is intentional. Either way, it has a classy look. Nothing bites in my hands. I can feel that there's spots on here, but nothing sharp, jagged, nothing that's gonna, I think, tear my little nubbins apart. Moving down to the saya transitions between these two pieces, I think actually look pretty nice between the Koiguchi and the Fuchi up here. It doesn't have, one isn't by an order of magnitude larger than the other, and overall it holds well. This has been used quite a bit, so that's nice to see as well. The saya is a simple black gloss saya, and it has brown horn components on it, which initially I will say that I did not like at all. Seeing black Ito, but I've actually come to like the brown horn fittings. The way the sun hits them, sometimes they glow a little bit in different lights, and they do provide some contrast, especially if you have kind of brown colored patinaed fittings or decide to do a brown Ito. It's a way to accent and move some color around that I've come to enjoy a little bit more. So I didn't like these. I remember seeing them and being like, I didn't like the brown ones, but I actually happen to like them now, especially when the sunlight kind of makes them glow like a little orb. The Kashura is, or not the Kashura, the Koiguchi area here, it fits well, it's tight, it doesn't bind, there's not a lot of rattle, if any. Let me hold these little shitidome down. No, I don't know if Sword Friend Garland may have adjusted the sai in some way, but no rattle, reasonable tension. And yeah, gloss, the horn fittings are all fit nice. There's nothing really to complain about. The planes on the saya are relatively smooth. There's not a ton of rippling. The lacquer is applied pretty evenly. It's overall reasonably well done. The Kurigata, I did bring this out to do some training. So obviously the sword is in one piece right now. I haven't broken it at this point in the review, but I did bring it outside to do some training with it. And as soon as I untied the presentation knot, I don't know if maybe I applied too much pressure, the Kurigata just popped off. So that was not ideal, not an ideal part of the sai. I applied a dab of super glue, and now it appears to be securely on there. And the shitidome also have come out. That happens just about all the time to anyone that puts little shitidome on the Kurigata. They tend to come out and then roll around and scratch the side. So I usually end up removing them, and it's one of those things where I think you could save a few cents by just not bothering with it. The Koiguchi is well formed. It's overall a nice scabbard. And this one in particular, I like the way it's not too raspy. Fits reasonably snug. Ronin does have some wax in the sai as well. They do that for various supply chain reasons. As I understand it, Ronin brings most of this stuff in from China, and then they store it in the US and ship out of the US. So a lot of times when you're working with a company, you're going to buy it and they're going to ship it from China, and it only has to survive without rusting for maybe a couple weeks, maybe a month. But Ronins have to survive for much longer being in a warehouse facility. So there's wax applied to it. Unfortunately, that wax remains in the scabbard, and what happens if you're using it is there's little waxy streaks that appear on it. Now this, if it's from 2018 and well used by Sword Friend Garland, I cleaned the sword off after I was playing with it, but now I still have some waxy residue that pops up. It's an irritation. I understand why it's there, but it is it is something that's irritating, because when you're doing no-to with it, I can feel these little wax boogers that stick on the sword. So I've heard that if you leave this out in the sun, the wax can melt or move or something like that, but it's interesting to see one that's been well used over a period of years and still has little waxy boogers in it. Anyway, Habaki, Ronin uses a Habaki that emulates like a two-piece appearance, but it doesn't have it in thickness or anything like that. But it's nice. It's a little different. It's got two grooves cut in it and then a scratch pattern on the bottom third of the Habaki, or bottom half. The blade, the polish on it is reasonably well done. If I talk about the polish on it first, it's more of a mirror polish, and then the hamon appears darker rather than lighter, and you can make out the lamination line on it. And that, I think the polish does a good job of accentuating those things, particularly in the sunlight. You can make out the lamination line and how it erratically kind of moves around the edge area. And you can spot some of those things which are fun to fish for. And the pattern on the hamon follows a somewhat irregular pattern. It's not quite choji. I don't know what pattern I would exactly call this. But anyway, the lines on the sword are very clean. The Shinogi-ji runs pretty crisply. It doesn't wander around. It appears very straight. There's no ripples in the surface of the steel. Overall, it's polished reasonably well. The Kisaki also has a slight swell to it, so it moves out a little bit. This one doesn't have a bohea, and I don't know if Ronin makes elite versions with bohea, but I'd suspect they do, and they may be more money. I think I've even seen some katana version of the Elites. I'm not sure. But the larger piece up here is what I noticed. I was able to hear the blade while training, but it was quiet. It moves through the air. I can't get it to make that swish sound very easily. It's pretty quiet, but the reinforced tip is nice to see, and I think helps with that a little bit. Otherwise, Yokote, not very well polished on. It kind of is there, but I don't see any attempt at burnishing or polishing differently. It kind of maintains the same mirror polish with kind of a geometric transition to where it starts to slope down. I can feel the transition in my hand, but it doesn't feel like it's the best polish on there. But that's fine. Anyway, that's the polish on the blade. Other than that, that's really what there is to see from a feature set. Now, in training with it, I can tell you about moving it around a little bit. This one had tight ito. It moved around really, really well. I actually enjoyed training with it. The transition and how it did Noto and the Saya was comfortable. From a training standpoint, the little boogers were about the only complaint that I'd have, apart from the kurigata coming off pretty quickly. That was not ideal. But again, this is a factory second and one that has seen some use. The little boogers are really the only irritation. It's something that I see on just about every Ronin Katana product. I totally understand why they do it. At the same time, it seems a challenging thing to abate afterwards. There's not an easy way for me to get the wax out of the scabbard, and then I have to deal with boogery kind of feeling wax stuff that comes out when I'm training with it. At the same time, it keeps the sword protected, and so that's not necessarily so bad. But it's about the only thing that I would note as an irritation. Apart from that, like feeling-wise, it feels like it has a tip-heavy presence. It's got heft to it, but at the same time, it's nimble enough. I would put it somewhere in the middle ground. Like I feel like it's gonna have some authority in the cut. Katana often do, but at the same time, not so much that I don't feel like I have point control or that I can't be agile. Do deflecting, glancing, things like that. I wouldn't describe this as a quick sword, though. Anyway, that's about all I can tell you from the usage perspective. It was comfortable to use. It's a beautiful little piece, but the thing I'm really doing with this video is pushing it to failure. So at this point, I'm going to stop the video. I'm going to go out and I'm going to do that. I'm going to push it to failure. My intent is to do some bottle cutting first, just to kind of see sharpness level, where it's at. Then I'm going to cut some branches, brush, things like that. I'll try to find something intermediary, hard, like a log or something that I can strike it into several times. From there, I'll throw the sword several times. We'll see how it holds up. Right in this point is where I'm expecting some damage to happen. This being a differentially hardened blade, I think it's going to take brush, branches, bottles, things like that in stride, and nothing too crazy is going to happen. The edge, I've had some issues with these in the past, having some small chips, so I wouldn't be surprised to see little bits of edge problems that theoretically you could sharpen out, but are not great. I'm kind of expecting maybe that will pop up. Once I do some more aggressive cutting into logs and things like that, I'm expecting to start to see some bends and stuff like that. So this is a differentially hardened blade. It's not through hardened. It's not going to be as resilient and spring back when I do some of that dumb stuff against a log. Then, when I throw it, I wouldn't be surprised if I lose a piece of the tip. Some of these fittings as well, I should note, they're all reasonably tight. The ito's tight. The Habaki has just, you can maybe hear it, just a little bit of rattle, so I'm expecting that some of that will loosen up more, and I might see some more bending. But we'll see, and then I think it's going to, probably, the lamination will probably expose itself on the croquet stick of doom. I don't imagine it's going to take too many strikes to break it in half, but that's just my assumption. It's not a terribly thick sword, and I'm guessing that the edge will break off because it's harder, and then it'll start cracking, but it might take a few strikes after it cracks to actually get it to pull apart, because there's a lot of different steels working inside here. So that's what I'm thinking is going to happen. We'll see if I'm right or not. Anyway, I'm going to stop here. I'm going to shut up, and I'm going to actually go do that. All right, sword friends, it is the future, and I will recant the experience of what it took to push the sword all the way to failure. Before I do, some notes on something that I forgot to mention in the first 20 minutes of this video. The Nakago, it's reasonably well dressed, far from the worst thing that I've ever seen, but I would love to see more attention to detail here. Less expensive swords from Huawei, even from Hanwei, have a little bit nicer Nakago, and it's just a detail that I appreciate in a sword. I don't blame Ronin for not doing it, though. A number of people never take the sword apart, so investing time and therefore money in it doesn't necessarily make a huge amount of sense. That said, it's a detail that I like to see. I think there's opportunity for improvement here without a whole lot of expense. Also, it's worth noting that the Suka core didn't break. I didn't look at it before cutting with it, but it's not broken after, so tip of my hat to Ronin for making a solid Suka core. Anyway, with the cutting, I brought it out first, tried to whack a milk jug. It batted around, more tore than cut. I tried a remnant of a pool noodle, just kind of batted it around as well. Basically, the sword isn't terribly sharp, and I didn't sharpen the sword. I did take a ceramic stone and went over it a couple times just to deburr anything that was there, but it wasn't terribly sharp, and that's fair. It's a secondhand sword. Sword friend Garland has used it before, and it's got some previous scratches and things like that, suggesting that he wasn't always gentle with it. So, not a surprise, but the edge didn't have any dings, chips, nicks, anything like that in it. I cut some water bottles, and those cut reasonably well. They cut smoothly. My form is bad, so they didn't stay on the stand, but overall, it was a smooth cut. The next thing that I did, though, was relatively abusive, and I brought it right to a downed tree branch that narrowly missed my neighbor's fence, and so I was using the opportunity to kind of knock the brush down so that I could get it out of the way before festivities for the 4th of July begin. Anyway, this is a large tree branch, and it's got some small sections that are, under an inch, and then towards the stem of this branch, it's, almost 7 or 8 inches in thickness, or maybe 6 inch, somewhere in there. It gets pretty thick, and it's older wood. Some parts of it are dead, some of it is pretty hard, so take that for what it's worth. Now, in cutting with the sword, moving through this brush didn't really do anything bad. It cut through the smaller twigs and leaves and all that kind of stuff just like you would expect. It moved through really easily. I got a feel for it. It's worth noting that this is the next day and I'm not fatigued or tired. The sword was not terribly cumbersome to move around. I'm easily exhausted, so that's a nice thing. But when I was moving through some of the 1 inch to maybe 2 inch sections of branch, it also held up well. It cut reasonably well. It sliced right through. The cuts were very clean, and I really had no complaints. There was a large section of branch where I could do several repeating kind of downward diagonal cuts, and it worked exceedingly well. I was happy with my performance, both the way I was cutting and the sword. Once it got to thicker stuff, though, and once I got to some bad cuts that weren't delivered with the most precision, the sword started to take a bend. And in a pretty consistent spot, about 4 inches down from the tip, is where it started to take a bend. And you'll notice throughout the cutting that I repeatedly had to straighten the sword out. So, and it continued to happen. As I was striking down and getting to thicker and thicker targets, the sword would bend more and more, pretty consistently in that section about 4 inches down, and then in some other spots throughout the sword. So by the end of this lengthy cutting session on this tree trunk area, or this branch that came down, the sword had bent, a handful of times and been straightened a handful of times and was a little wobbly. Each time I could straighten it out, but it's concerning that, you strike, the sword bends, and just a little smack on the side straightens it out. It suggests that the metal is softening. I would grab it and kind of hold where the bend had been straightened, and it felt hot. So, there's something happening in the inside of the sword that it's not particularly happy with. But at this point, it's worth noting that there's no chips. In the previous Ronin Katana Elite that I had tested, it chipped relatively easily, or had some small chip on a thing that I don't think it should have chipped on. In this case, I'm cutting into some larger wood, and at no point did it chip at all, which I think is certainly something good. And I'm doing some aggressive stuff here. The sword is not an axe. It's not supposed to cut through tree branches. And that's what I'm doing. So this is a debatably abusive thing. Should the sword bend? I think it's acceptable to bend here. It's not ideal. I would love it if it did not, but I would love it if I were a better cutter too. Differentially, hardened blades tend to bend when I cut into large log-like objects, and they don't cut in half. Then the swords do tend to bend. So it's par for the course, I would say. Love it if it didn't, or if it was a little harder to bend, but it was not, and it straightened out pretty easy and made its way through clearing the brush anyway. So from clearing this large brush section, I can note towards the end of it, basically, apart from bending and seeing some wobble down the edge, no edge damage, no issues to speak of. The kashra did come off. That probably happened a little while ago in the video that you're watching here. But the kashra did come off pretty quickly in the beginning, actually. It wobbled a little bit, and I caught it at a time where I could have fixed it, but I chose not to. I just pulled the kashra off, put it in my pocket, and continued with the cutting. I try not to repair stuff midway through testing. General gist is, though, that I could have, in theory, glued the kashra back on and tucked the ito underneath, and it would have held up as a piece for a time if I had just stopped cutting and remedied the situation. I chose to continue, so I pulled it off pretty easy. Continued from there. The ito also came undone over this course, and I had stopped several times to just tie it at different points. Once I got the knot reasonably tight, it didn't move any more than that. Little bits of hijigami fell out and stuff like that, but the handle held together well and actually didn't crack throughout this process, so overall it held up pretty well. The next thing that I did, though, is I brought it over to the tree. It's got some logs and branches stuck there for future cutting videos, and I just chucked it at the tree. Now, this is a dumb thing, and in fairness, all the things that I've done here are dumb. Water bottles are pretty soft. Cutting tree branches, that's not what a sword would likely encounter, but theoretically a sword might encounter, spears or something like that. So cutting 1 inch to 1.5 inch thick bits of wood or softer kind of green wood, like I'm cutting in a 2-inch variety, quasi simulates that, not in a real degree, but it's a thing that a sword might encounter on a battlefield. Cutting into a 6-inch log is not so much the case. Throwing the sword at a tree, if you dropped your sword off your horse or something like that, or you lost it and somebody struck it out of your hands, theoretically might encounter that kind of force. These are all very feathery, not exact tests, even if you want to call them tests. But that's kind of the thought process behind it. Now, I thought when I started this that when I threw it at a tree, it would break or chunks would come off. That didn't happen. Nothing actually even loosened that much, though it did loosen around the Suba and the Habaki a little bit. But that was really it, and it took some big bends when it struck the tree and stopped. It turned into something that resembled a horseshoe by the end of it. Anyway, at the end of throwing the sword, I straightened it out and then moved on to the next most abusive thing, which is striking into the brass fitting on a barrel. Worth noting that the brass fitting, actually, it cut into it pretty deeply. I don't usually measure this kind of stuff, but it's just worth noticing that it cut through into the center of the fitting when I struck it. Edge damage was apparent, though. Right away I could tell that the edge took some significant damage. Sword edges don't always take damage here, is worth noting. Even differentially hardened ones, sometimes I strike the barrel and there's very minimal damage. Here there was some significant deflection right at the end. After several strikes, there was some small chipping. I would say it could be sharpened out at this stage, though. It's not so damaged that you couldn't keen it back up, but it would take a little bit of work to do anything. It's not going to polish out, but you could theoretically sharpen it and still have a functional edge ready to go for another battle. When I took it to the croquet stake of doom, this is where things unraveled pretty quickly. So one strike in, I struck lower on the croquet stake of doom to kind of show the damage. It was very similar, actually, to the brass fitting on the barrel. Not too much more damage. Several more strikes, though, and the blade snapped, basically. And it snapped. It's worth noting as well here that the lamination likely held it together because it snapped and broke, and I didn't notice until I struck it again, and then it peeled open quite a bit more where I noticed and slowed down and stopped. And even then, the lamination along the spine continued to hold, and I could do the final snap. But it was really only 5 or 6 strikes in total on the croquet stake of doom before the blade snapped. I did have to turn it around and strike it on the back, which is frankly what I would have liked to see. Now, differentially hardened blades, par for the course or acceptable is a few strikes. The fact that it made it to the croquet stake of doom is a good thing and a testament to durability. Some swords don't make it to the croquet stake of doom and break doing other things. This did not. However, ideally, it takes several strikes in the croquet stake of doom, and I have to turn it around on the spine to strike it and open up those cracks. That didn't happen here. I would have loved if that was the case. It didn't take very many strikes. And unfortunately, that is kind of what I was expecting, but at the same time, I would have loved it if it lasted a little bit longer. So anyway, that is what it took to bring the blade all the way to failure. So once it broke, I'm showing you the cross-section here of the blade so you can see what it looks like. Then after showing you the cross-section, take some photos so that you can see what the break looks like. I brought it outside and I sanded it flat, or kind of flat. It's at a bit of a pitch. After I did that, I sanded it as flat as I could. I let it sit in a vinegar solution for 24 hours, which is why I'm doing this part of the video the next day. And I don't know if that's long enough, because at this time, I can't tell if it's good or bad. Honestly, I don't know if what I'm seeing is Soshu Kite or not. For contrast, I have a little bit of a video of sitting next to a Sanmai billet from a different sword that I broke some time ago, and you can see the large contrast here. One reason that I've taken kind of 3 sections and I'm showing you kind of the process, because they each seem to indicate a little bit more detail than I see in the final etch. So basically, it needs another week. I'm going to stop here and check back in later. Alright, sword friends, it is once again the future. I've left the sword in the vinegar bath for roughly a week, and I've been rewarded for the efforts. There is a more complex lamination style here. What it isn't, though, is clearly definitive as Soshu Kite, and so there's some context that I've learned along the way that I want to share. I heard that basically 1045 and 1060, if really well forge weld, may appear homogeneous, and that means that my vinegar technique may not be sufficient to identify this as Soshu Kite or not. So that is an important caveat to put in here, which I probably should have known from the beginning, but I didn't. Regardless, though, my vinegar etching technique does not clearly define or show this as Soshu Kite. And I've been tempted to break another section. In fact, I have gone so far as to break other sections of the sword, and I will etch them. Bam, it's the future, and I've taken the broken bits of sword, etched them for nearly a month, reviewed them, and the short answer is I still don't see Soshu Kite. At least not anything that definitively says Soshu Kite. I did find one more lamination in there along the spine. The Munet appears to have a little hat area that is a different forge weld, but I didn't see that before, I think because it was either sanded off or flattened out by the area that I broke on the sword previously. Anyway, the short answer is I did find one more weld, but the side walls where the 1045 and 1060 are supposed to be, I don't see multiple layers there. And so I'm missing basically 2 forge welds, and that's what I can't seem to find. I do see a difference on the spine, I see a difference in the core, I see a difference in the edge, and then I see the side walls being different, but not 2 different separate sidewall sections. That's what I'm missing from the forge welding, and as I understand it, 1045 and 1060 may appear to be homogeneous when they're forge welded together, which may explain why I was missing the hat in some of them, and I had to see it in a few different lights at different points in the etch. But I digress. It is a much more complicated type of etch, or a much more complicated type of forge welding than I've seen in other swords, but I can't definitively say, based on the techniques that I'm using, that it is or is not Soshu Kite. I can say it's complicated, but I can't say that it's that. There is another note worth pointing out here, and that is that it was much harder to break on the subsequent breaks. Each one got harder. That's not necessarily uncommon, but all of them were an order of magnitude harder to break than the first one. So if the sword were to act a little bit more like the second and third breaks, then I would be very happy with the durability. I didn't think that the first one held up terribly well. It held up as I'd expect, but I would have loved it to last longer, like the second and third breaks did. But basically, it was harder to break as I went on. So anyway, those are the notes that I have. Unfortunately, I can't definitively answer one of the questions I set out to in making this video, which is, are these definitively Soshu Kite blades? I can say they're complicated, but I can't say for sure. And I'm missing, namely, 2 forge welds before I could say yes. The other bit that I was going to answer is, if it is, then what benefit does this complex lamination technique have? The benefit that I noticed really started to come through in the second and third breaks, where the edge would chip and start kind of cutting in substantially, but the sword would stay together and it would almost peel apart a little bit. The laminations would start coming apart. So it doesn't make it stronger than a Dojo Pro, if I think of the amount of strikes that it took to break that sword versus this sword. They're relatively similar, but at the same point, this one didn't catastrophically fail right away. It would kind of crack, that crack would expand, and then eventually it would peel apart or kind of fly off. But that lamination helped bind things together. Now, a through hardened sword I still think is probably a more durable option. It's more forgiving in the types of stupid tests that I do to destroy these swords. But the lamination technique did show that if you're using a differentially hardened blade, that the crack will be at least, it might buy you a few more strikes than if you didn't have a more complicated lamination technique or some sort of lamination technique holding it together. The sword would crack, where that would typically result in a failure on a mono steel blade. The lamination basically held that crack in place, and only when it was further pounded on in the same spot did it really open up and then come apart. So it does do something for retention on differentially hardened blades, but I would still argue that a through hardened blade is going to be a more resilient piece overall, even if it fails more catastrophically when it does fail. anyway, that's what I have. Hopefully it's been educational. I'm sorry I can't definitively answer the question, but that brings me to the point, do I personally think the sword is worth it or not? And for me, I would still say yes. I'm taking a little bit on faith that Ronin Katana is supervising these and that it's Soshu Kite and that my method is basically flawed and not sufficient. I would say absolutely yes if I could definitively show it, but I have to take it a little bit on faith. Well, not on faith, but in the knowledge that my methods may not be sufficient to show the difference between the 1045 and 1060 if they're properly smushed together. So anyway, that said, it's still a very complicated lamination technique, and the sword is still very fun to move around, free Ido and those types of activities and basic cutting. And I think they're all a little bit unique, but some of the fittings that they have on the Elites are handsome, and it just makes a cool pattern. It doesn't have folding or hada or anything like that. It really highlights the lamination technique that Ronin's using, and I like the look of the sword, frankly. It's one of the few swords that in my history as a collector I've bought retail and paid full price for, and I still say that they make good swords. But who is it for? That is maybe a tougher question to answer. It's not a competition cutting style blade. The fittings, most of which personally I do find don't resonate with me. They're a little bit on the gaudy side for me, but some of them I like. It's a little heavier than most people would want to use for Iaido, and it's not folded. It doesn't show all the same kind of things. It draws some, I don't know, pays homage to a historical technique used, but not with the same kind of folded steels. Those are in like the Project X blades and some of the others. So who wants it? Well, I guess if you do, that's really the question. If you find the value in the features that this sword has, then I think it's good. But at the same time, I don't necessarily who it's for. If you want something really durable, the Dojo Pro is, I think, as durable or more so, and it's half the price. If you want something folded, a little bit more money buys you a Project X blade that has, folded walls in it. It pays both the homage to the complex lamination technique as well as having some of the folded steel. It's not obviously the same as Nihonto, but it's a little bit, I don't know, I like the look of the folded steel. I think I'd like it more if it had that. So anyway, who's it for? I'm not exactly sure, but if you happen to like it, then I still think it's a cool sword. So that's what I can add. Hopefully it's been helpful. Special thanks to sword friend Garland, who sent me this sword for the purposes of making this video. Hopefully you found it educational, and that's all I've got. Incidentally, I also actually want to note, but it's not all I've got. This is my last video filming in the location that I'm at right now. I've been in the home I'm in, the backyard, that I've broken so many swords, and I've been here for like 15 years. And the first video that I made was a Ronin Katana, and I'm very happy that the last video I'm going to make here is also about a Ronin Katana. It was their base level, and 15 years later, I'm closing it out with their high-end stuff, and it's been very fun. It's bittersweet to leave the house. I love the spot that I'm in, but I started here with Ronin Katana, and I'm ending here with Ronin Katana, and I'll start a new chapter in the next place. But that's why there hasn't been so much content from me, because I'm mid-move, but I wanted to get this one out because I don't know, felt right. Anyway, that is truly all I have. Cheers, and thanks for watching.